Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Office of the Chief Scientist Science Seminar Series. My name is Mark Edwards, a Senior Science Advisor with the OCS and your host for today's seminar. On behalf of the entire OCS team, I welcome you to today's event. Now, in the spirit of reconciliation, I'd like to respectfully acknowledge that today we are broadcasting throughout Alberta and beyond on the traditional lands and gathering places for Treaties 4, 6, 7, 8, and Treaty 10, and the homeland of the Métis people. Wherever you find yourself today, I encourage you to recognize and acknowledge the shared relationship that First Nations, Inuit, and Métis have with the land upon which we all live, work, learn, and play. And in keeping with the tradition of gathering, these science seminars provide an opportunity for us to get together to exchange knowledge on interesting science happening across Alberta in an open learning and sharing environment. The hope is that through our dialogue today, we are all able to improve our awareness and understanding and put this knowledge into practice to support evidence-informed decision-making wherever that occurs. To help maintain the call quality today, your video and audio have been disabled, but you can enter your questions and comments at any time during or after the presentation via the chat. After the presentation has concluded, I will read the questions out in the order that they were received. Now, today we are welcoming Dr. David Suachyn, presenting on how much of the variability in Alberta's climate is natural and how much is related to global climate change. David's research interests are variability in prairie hydroclimate over the past millennium and adaptations to minimize the adverse impacts of climate change. He's given more than 500 invited talks on aspects of climate variability and change, and he traces his Alberta roots, back to the 1910s, when his grandparents arrived from Eastern Canada to homestead and from the Ukraine to coal mine. Over to you, Dr. Suachyn.
Great, thanks Mark for that introduction, and thanks for having me today. I'm really pleased to be speaking to this audience. This scene on my cover slide is looking southwest across the valley of the Oldman River, and it sort of captures the ecosystems of southwestern Alberta. This title I've chosen is kind of provocative and ambitious because I'm not sure I have an answer, but just downstream on the Oldman River up in the Porcupine Hills, I think I found the answer, because one of the ranchers, Reno Welsh, told me that with weather, there's nothing written in stone. And I couldn't have said it better, that the weather and climate are so complex, it's hard to find any simple answers. Reno told me that he found a 60-year weather cycle in this country. He said approximately 60 years, because it could be 70, it could be less. And so we'll come back to that in a few minutes. But he does make a distinction between a cycle. He refers only to cycles. He didn't mention change, and that's a pretty important distinction, because a lot of the misinformation, a lot of the debate around climate change is a confusion about the difference between weather, climate variability, and climate change. And as this diagram attempts to show, weather is recorded conditions, whereas climate is statistics. And weather persists only for hours, weeks, maybe months, whereas climate is based on statistics of weather from months to centuries in duration. Now, the important distinction between variability and change is variability is cyclical, it's reversible, whereas climate change is some kind of shift in the hydroclimate that persists for many decades, or at least centuries. And also notice the difference in scale. Local occurs where you are at the present, weather occurs where you are at the present time. Variability has a strong regional signal, and the strongest indication of climate change is global. And therefore we call it global warming. And this is the strongest indication that our climate is changing. This is the average temperature of the whole world every month back to January 1880, and as recently as last month, I guess. And if that month was warmer than average, where average is the 20th century, then it's red, and a month with below average temperatures is in blue. Thing to note is that since the late 1970s, every single month, with one tiny exception in 1984, otherwise every single month has been warmer than average. So this is pretty conclusive evidence, at least, that there's an increase in the amount of heat in the atmosphere. But otherwise, this diagram can be misinterpreted. It has its drawbacks. Scientists love it, but after all, the temperature of the whole world doesn't exist. It's a statistical concept. You can grab your phone and, well, don't grab your phone. You can listen to me, but when you look at your weather app, the Earth is not one of the options. When you look at your weather app, it gives you the high and low temperature expected day after day. It doesn't give you an average. Average is to a large extent meaningless. It's statistical. So that's one drawback of this diagram, is the temperature of the whole world doesn't exist. But otherwise, it kind of gives the impression that the climate is changing and warming everywhere and all the time, which in fact is not true. You can see that there is some fluctuation from year to year. There are years in which there's only a marginal difference between the average and the temperature. And there's other years, for example, very recently, when the global temperature anomaly is approaching 1.5. So despite the illustrative purposes of a diagram like this, we're more concerned not about the temperature of the whole world, but the temperature where we are living. And so let's look for evidence in Alberta where maybe the climate is warming. And where we find that evidence is in the lowest temperatures. So I downloaded daily temperature data for Edmonton back to 1882 and up until the end of last year. And I determined for every year how many days was the temperature below 30 and how many days was it below 35. And so the combination of the two, the minus 35 stacked on top of the minus 30, is what these bars represent. And I think what's noticeable is there was a shift in the climate in the mid-20th centuries, whereby prior to the 1950s, there were lots of years in which the temperature dropped below minus 30 and below minus 35 for at least a month. That's cumulatively a month. Whereas since the 1950s, there's been a single year, and I've highlighted that year with a drop-down arrow, a single year in which the combination of those two extreme temperatures exceeded 30 days. That year, 1969, I remember well. I was there in high school in Edmonton, and all the primary and secondary school students got a certificate for the Edmonton Journal for having survived 26 days, in which 21 of the days are below minus 30, and the highest the temperature reached on any day was minus 21. And I can still remember just bursting outside in a t-shirt and enjoying the warmth of minus 21. It's just hard to imagine. And we still get minus 30, obviously, and even minus 35, but it doesn't persist for a whole month like it did back in the day. And here's another way of showing that. In fact, I was showing my research associate, Dr. Mohammed Zari, I was showing him this diagram, and he came to me this morning. He said, I took your data and I created a heat map, so to speak, where those bars represent the frequency of days each year with record high minimum temperatures. It's a bit much to wrap your head around, but there's 365 days in the year, and there's going to be some days in which we get a record high minimum temperature, the temperature when you wake up in the morning. And you can see that shift from the mid-20th centuries where there's quite a few years in which there were no record high temperatures, and since the mid 20th century, there's only been 2 years without record high temperatures. So this gradation from white to light blue to dark blue from left to right is a signal of warming. But there's also something else going on here. There are decades that are darker blue and decades that are lighter blue, and that's the natural variability. So the natural variability is occurring like it always has been, but in a climate that's getting warmer and warmer. So there's one indication, probably the best indication, is that our climate on the prairies, it's not getting hotter, it's getting much less cold. And here's another great hydrometric record that has a signal of climate change. This is the natural flow of the Bow River because it's at Banff and there's no dams or diversions above Banff. But this is for the month of August. And historically in August, the flow of the Bow River has been maintained by the melting of the Bow Glacier and also snowfields at high elevation. And you can see the fairly dramatic decline in the flow of the Bow River in August because that supplement, that source of water, is quickly disappearing. But again, something else is going on. There is that downward decline in the Bow River, despite the fact that in some years there is fairly high flow. And once again, that's natural variability. And we can attribute these peaks, these high flows, to summer precipitation. So for example, one of those years, 1999, I looked at the precipitation data for Banff, and sure enough, in July and August, there were some really wet days. There was 2 days, 2 consecutive days in July, in which there was 25 millimeters of precipitation each day. And then later July, there was a day in which the precipitation reached almost 35 millimeters. And thus, these high flows, despite the fact that on average, there's a declining trend. Now, for the most part, these wet Augusts or wet summers reflect natural variability, but there's a lot of evidence to suggest that in a warmer climate, there should be an amplification of the hydrological cycle, that the wet years should be even wetter and the dry years should be even drier. And this is some basic geophysics. It's because most of the world is water. Here's Turtle Island, surrounded by water. The Pacific Ocean to the west is 16 times larger than Canada. It has a tremendous capacity to store heat. And so most of the extra heat that we're trapping next to the Earth is being taken up by the oceans. And the Pacific Ocean is the source of most of our water. So in this image, you can see 3 storms that are developing over the Pacific Ocean and bringing water to Western Canada. And according to basic geophysics, the fact that warmer water will produce more vapor and that warmer air can store more vapor, and that vapor has to precipitate at some point. And so according to basic geophysics, but also observations, there's an increase in the intensity of precipitation. So let's go downstream from Banff. This is the gauge at Medicine Hat on the South Saskatchewan River. And this is naturalized flow. And I have to give a shout out to your hydrologists like AAPA because they've produced this fantastic naturalized flow record that is so critical for our type of research. And in fact, Shoma just sent me an update last week and I'll be able to incorporate it. So this is a plot of the naturalized flow of the South Saskatchewan, and it's plotted as anomalies. Positive anomalies are blue, negative anomalies or low flows are in red. And there's no indication all the way down in Medicine Hat of this declining flow because the melt of the glaciers, the melt of the Bow River is evident at Banff. But once you incorporate the Old Man, which doesn't have glaciers, the Old Man River Basin, there's no indication in the naturalized flow of declining levels. But what's quite evident is the amount of natural variability from year to year. And that is, as far as we can tell, a function of the teleconnection between our river basins and the Atlantic, the Atlantic, but especially the Pacific Ocean, and in particular, the circulation of the Pacific Ocean and the year-to-year fluctuation in sea surface temperature that we call the El Nino Southern Oscillation. And this little chart, I've taken a record of the El Ninos in red and the La Ninas in blue back to 1897. I'm not going to try to correlate them with the flow of the river, but if you have time, if we had time, there's a pretty strong correlation. Well, what the heck? I mean, just look at the 1980s, a bunch of pretty much consecutive El Ninos, and the 1980s were dry. So there is a correlation. But what I want to point out is how the El Ninos and La Ninas will cluster so that you'll get 4 of one type in a single decade. And that results in this decadal variability in our hydroclimate. We get the clustering of wet and dry years, and we get a cycle of a decade or 2 or 3 of drier climate, and then we get a subsequent decade to 3 decades in which most years are wet. This is the 60-year cycle that our friend Reno found in the Cypress Hills. And this is critical because it means that the clustering of El Nino and the clustering of La Nina and something called the Pacific Decadal Oscillation is causing sustained wet periods and sustained dry periods. And the duration of wet and dry is a critical parameter because if you get successive wet years, then the water begins to accumulate and in some cases results in flooding. The more serious scenario is we get successive dry years and there's a depletion of surface water, groundwater, and eventually catastrophic consequences if a drought was to last decades. But it's happened. Now, I just finished praising this hydrometric record, but it does have a limitation. It goes all the way back to 1912, but a 111-year record only captures at most 2 cycles of 50 to 60 years in length. So if you want to properly understand this decadal scale cycling of our climate, you need a much longer record. And of course, I have that. That's why I'm here. Here's a piece of wood from the Kootenay Plains that my lab assistants cross-dated to the year 542. So this piece of wood came from a seedling, a tree that was a seedling in 542. This is the oldest piece we have in our collection, but we have a lot of wood that dates back to the first millennium. Because we've been collecting wood at every one of those green pins back to 1980s every summer. And the thing to note is we have a heavy concentration of sampling sites on the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains, especially in the headwaters of the South Saskatchewan River. And that's because that's where we find the oldest trees, but also this is where our work is most relevant because so many people on the prairies in Saskatchewan, Alberta in particular, depend on water from the South Saskatchewan River and the North Saskatchewan. And just to emphasize that, especially for American audiences, I use this satellite image on the left of North America at night, where the illumination is a proxy for population. And the thing to note is in the Western North America, between the West Coast and the Mississippi River, the densest population is not in the US, it's in Alberta. So you can see Calgary, Edmonton, and the Edmonton-Calgary axis. According to this proxy of population, This is the densest population in Western North America in between the coast and the Mississippi River, and thus the demand for water in the South Saskatchewan River. Here's some of our sampling sites in Alberta. Upper left, Douglas fir. Bottom right, a limber pine on the whalebacks. And virtually all of the wood we collect is from dry south and west facing slopes where the signal is of soil moisture. But the oldest wood we have is dead wood. So the bottom left is a piece of Douglas fir that's been lying there for a few hundred years. And as long as the soil is dry, or there's no soil at all, there's rock, it's amazing how especially the fir and the limber pine will survive hundreds of years lying on the ground, waiting for us to come along and take a little cross section. We also find old wood in the buildings, the original buildings that the settlers built on the prairies. And so we, with their permission, we collect wood from these structures. And here's another site on the right. There's my field assistant at the time, Jonathan Borichevich from Valdivia, Chile. And we're contemplating how we're going to take this little steel chainsaw and collect a cross-section of this big dead limber pine. This is up on a mesa, and you can see the mesa in the distance and the picture on the left. This is a Pecani land, so we have a really good relationship, fortunately, with the Pecani First Nation, and they let us go up there and collect old pieces of limber pine. And in the foreground is a weather station established by the Alberta government of Alberta. And one of the parameters they measure at this weather station is soil moisture. And here's a remarkable soil moisture record from that Brockett weather station back to 2008. And soil moisture at various depths. You can see that at a shallow depth of 5 centimeters, there's less soil moisture, but it varies a lot from season to season. Whereas at a depth of 1 meter, there's a fair bit of soil moisture and it's fairly consistent from year to year. And so this is the moisture that drives tree growth. And if we had records like this everywhere, we'd be able to calibrate our tree rings, but we don't. This is an exceptional record. For the most part, continuous soil moisture has been measured only for the last couple decades because the sensors, the technology has only existed for a few decades to have a continuous record of soil moisture. But there are other hydroclimatic parameters. And I took this illustration from a recent paper where they, for thousands of watersheds across Europe, they looked at the correlation between soil moisture and other hydroclimatic variables that you can see labeled in this diagram. And they found that the strongest correlation of soil moisture was not with precipitation or evapotranspiration, it was with runoff. Runoff and soil moisture are closely correlated. And in fact, they recommended that if you don't have soil moisture data, use runoff as a proxy. Now, there's lots of runoff data for Western Canada because when the water runs off, it runs off into lakes, streams, rivers, canals, reservoirs, and of course, we need that water, so we measure it. So here is a graph of the observed and tree ring reconstructed flow of the Ghost River at Cochrane. Okay, so the observed is from a gauge, but it's naturalized thanks to you folks at Alberta Environment. And the green is reconstructed from tree rings that we've collected in the Bow Valley. And you can see the pretty good fit. I mean, I have to admit, this is one of our better records. Obviously, I'm not going to show you a weaker one, but we get pretty good results where based on this correlation, based on this statistical relationship between tree growth and runoff, we can then reconstruct the runoff over the length of the tree rings. And so here is an update of our reconstruction of the South Saskatchewan River at Medicine Hat back to the year 1100. We could go back further, but I've cut it off at 1100. Further back we go, the less data we have. And we've been updating this reconstruction every few years, and we just recently did that. Once again, it's anomalies. So this is a record of the dry years and wet years in the South Saskatchewan River Basin. And we don't have too much time to ponder this thing, so let's go right off to the right-hand side to the most recent years. And you can see the dry years of the two zeros in the 1980s. You can see the 1930s. You can see these wet decades when Alberta was basically populated for agriculture. And so we know the weather of these years because we had weather stations. But just prior to the settlement of the prairies, there was a drought that lasted a couple decades. It's actually a bit more than a couple decades. Relatively few wet years, hardly wet at all, and a lot of almost consecutive dry years between the late 1840s and the 1870s. And this drought is relatively well known. This is when John Palliser came through and said that a large region will be forever comparatively useless. He told the government, forget it, don't come here. But of course, the railroad and the government ignored the scientist. I guess I should be fortunate because that's my grandfather, disking the prairie sod. That's my grandfather homesteading in southern Alberta. And when the settlers came, the Medicine Hat newspaper said it was criminal to bring them. But the editors of the newspaper were still aware of the fact that they had just been exposed to a drought of a couple of decades in duration. Now, the worst case scenario, the worst case future scenario, and by the way, my grandparents did okay till the 1930s and the homestead blew away, so they moved up and bought a farm near Edmonton. But of course, that region of southern Alberta is now special areas because it was depopulated in the 30s. And the worst case scenario for the prairies for Alberta in the coming years is when these droughts reoccur, but in a warmer climate. So what's going to happen when the 1930s reoccur, but our summers are that much warmer? Or even worse, what about when the drought of the mid-19th century, the drought I just showed you of the 1840s, 50s, and 60s, when it reoccurs in the future, but in a warmer climate? So the only way to answer that question is to look at the future climate. And we don't have tree rings. We don't have river flow data for the future. We have to depend on models. So we take these models that simulate the climate of the whole world. And on a grid, and those grid cells are usually about 100 kilometers or more in width. So there would only be about 6 or 8 for Alberta. So what we do is we use data from regional climate models where the GCM data have been dynamically downscaled to a resolution of 25 kilometers. So that map that was produced in our lab, in this case, the parameter, it's temperature, how about that? It's probably winter temperature. It's probably the change in winter temperature because it's anywhere between 2.5 and more than 5 degrees in northern Alberta. So, but the variable doesn't matter. It just shows you the kind of resolution that we can get and the kind of maps we can produce when we dynamically downscale the data. Now, we didn't do the downscaling. Another lab did. But we do our own downscaling because fortunately in our lab, we have a climate scientist and he runs a regional climate model for Alberta. And he's downscaling it to 3-kilometer resolution. On the left is a map of southern Alberta with the boundary of Calgary highlighted. And on the right is the city of Edmonton, where we have produced climate change projections at a neighborhood scale for the city of Edmonton. Because Edmonton paid for it and NMAX paid for it for southern Alberta, it's not cheap to run a climate model on a supercomputer, and it generates a huge amount of data. So that little box in the upper right, that's a 96 terabyte storage device where we store the data from regional climate models, either from other modeling centers or the model that Shumik Basu in our lab has been running. It looks impressive, but the bottom line is we can't possibly know the future. We don't know if this is true. We don't know if this is correct. It's only the best science we have. So rather than rely on a single model, which may or may not be correct, we use data from a lot of models. And here is temperature data for Calgary back to 1950 and out to the end of the century. And it's from 26 different models, the so-called CMIP6 models, which might mean something to you folks. And there's historical data in gray. This is historical model data. So this is what the model tells us about the past. And in the future, there are 3 different scenarios depending on the SSP. SSP is the shared socioeconomic pathway. It's how we choose to live out for the rest of this century, and how we choose to live will determine how much more we modify the climate. And so the optimistic scenario is the blue one, which is history. We've already exceeded that much warming. So mid-range scenario 4.5, and the most likely scenario is 8.5, which is the trajectory that we're currently on. But I put this in here to make the point that we can't know the future, and the reason is we don't know which pathway we're going to take, but also the models don't agree. So irrespective of the pathway, that shading shows the range of projections for the 26 models. Okay, so if we're uncertain because the models don't agree, and if we're uncertain because we don't know which scenario we're going to follow, then let's just choose one model and one scenario. And let's run that model 50 times and we'll get the same result. No, that's not true. This is the same model, the exact same experiment, run 50 times by Environment and Climate Change Canada, and you get a different result every time because of the complexity of the climate. Statistically, they're all the same. So they all show an upward trend, but the sequence of wet and dry years is different, which is why I haven't assigned calendar dates to these 150 years, because the wet and the dry will occur in different years for each of the different projections, for each of the different time series. Okay, so we have 3 possible certain sources of uncertainty. Here, the uncertainty is not due to using different models because we only used one. It's not due to different emission scenarios because we used only one. The uncertainty here is just the natural internal variability of the climate system. Here's those 3 sources of uncertainty in our ability to project the future climate. And a few years ago, I was having coffee with Dr. Elaine Barrow from Environment and Climate Change Canada, who also happens to live in Regina, which is fortunate. And I said, Elaine, is it possible to take a whole bunch of data from climate models and determine which of these causes the greatest amount of uncertainty? And she said, in typical Elaine modest fashion, well, I'll try. And she got great results, and it got published in the International Journal of Climatology. So I'm going to show you 4 graphs, 4 diagrams, one for each season of the year for the Canadian prairies, and the relative influence of these 3 sources of variability. And it's just swamped by natural variability, especially in the near term. So the uncertainty depends on how far into the future you are projecting the climate. By the time we get towards the end of the 21st century, the model uncertainty, the greenhouse gas emission uncertainty increases a bit. But even so, by far, the dominant source of uncertainty is just the natural variability of our climate, because it tends to swamp the signal of climate change. And of course, I was quite delighted by this result, because in our lab, we have a source of information on natural variability for the last millennium. And yeah, and just to illustrate that point, this is the projection of spring precipitation every year from 1950 to the end of this century for the MD of Bighorn, just outside of Calgary. And this is results from a single model experiment, the Canadian Regional Climate Model version 4, used to downscale the Canadian Earth System Model version 2. Anyway, that's a big acronym. But what it shows is we can expect more precipitation in spring at the end of the century, which is a pretty consistent scenario throughout the prairies and among the different models that we can expect, we can enjoy in our dry climate, more spring precipitation. But it's not a huge increase. And also, how do we get from 1950 to 2099? A huge amount of natural variability from year to year and decade to decade. And so the critical piece of information is not that we can eventually expect a bit more water on average. It's in order to get there, in order to take advantage of more water in the spring, we have to withstand and adapt to a larger range of moisture conditions, from exceptionally wet years like nothing we've ever seen to years that are just as dry or drier than in the past. Because after all, of course, the baseline is going up. And so the deviation from the baseline could be as large or larger in the future. So that's just about it. But just in terms of a take-home message is that if the climate change is related to temperature, it's pretty clear. So I showed you those minimum temperatures. I showed you the effect of the melting snow and glaciers. There's been lots of research on the prairies. There's some fantastic research going on the impact of climate change on prairie hydrology and about the shift in the snowmelt, the shift in the timing of the snowmelt, the shift in the volume of snowmelt, about the impact of a change in the ratio of snow to rain. Well, those effects are all temperature related and they're relatively clear. It's when the impacts of climate change are precipitation related that it's much more difficult to detect the effect of climate change. Regional temperature change is directly linked to global temperature change. Regional precipitation change is a function of the regional dynamics of the atmosphere and the oceans, which is much where the link between the regional dynamics of the hydroclimate has a much more indirect link to global warming. And so if people tell you, and I have people tell me this, they say, I haven't seen any indication of climate change. Well, typically these are people who depend on water, and they depend on water in the spring to plant a crop or to irrigate. And what they're seeing is they're seeing the season to season and year to year variability in precipitation. And if that's their focus, then I'm sympathetic. It's difficult to see relative to the fairly, I guess, gentle or gradual is a better way, gradual changes in the average conditions over many decades. Just want to let you know that if you want to read more about our tree ring stuff, it's written up in a lot of ag magazines. Farmers love the tree rings because they're real, whereas models are not. And it's written up in John Deere magazine, Western Producer, Farming for Tomorrow. And a few years ago, this Canadian Cowboy magazine asked me to write an article. They didn't put me on the cover, but unlike this guy, I haven't lost my job. So, yeah. And if you can see our stuff used in reports like the City of Calgary drought plan that came out recently features tree rings on the cover. And EPCOR in their source water protection plan for Edmonton devotes a couple pages to an analysis of our tree ring data that they paid for because in that river basin they've been very supportive of our work. So thanks for listening. And I also want to thank the people that give us access to the trees. So that's ranchers, First Nations, and in this particular case, we're on the Walden Ranch, but it's also the Black Creek Heritage Rangeland, and it's also the Bald Creek Wildland. So we have permits from the Alberta government to do research in this incredibly spectacular place. Thanks.
Thank you so much for sharing this amazing work with us. I want to thank everyone for joining our science seminar today. Our next science seminar will be on Tuesday, February 11th with Dr. Stephen Spencer and Anish Munawira, who will be presenting on leveraging citizen science data with advanced statistical models, recent updates on lake sturgeon monitoring in Alberta. Thank you so much, Dr. Suachyn. Amazing presentation, great questions. For everybody else, if you are not on our mailing list and would like to be added, please contact the Office of Chief Scientist at epa.ocs@gov.ab.ca. We'll end there today. Thanks again to our presenters for sharing their work with us, and to everyone who tuned in. Thank you so much.